A thug gripped his baseball bat, certain the royal guard wouldn't react, but the moment he swung, everything changed. In mere seconds, he went from predator to prey, and the crowd saw firsthand why these soldiers are not to be tested. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So subscribe to both and never miss a powerful story. The metallic scrape of a baseball bat against concrete echoed through the afternoon air at Buckingham Palace, causing tourists to instinctively step aside. Marcus Thorne dragged the aluminum bat along the ground as he approached, each scratch against the pavement like nails on a chalkboard. His muscled frame, adorned with crude prison tattoos, cut an imposing figure against the historic backdrop. "Look at this place," he sneered, hefting the bat onto his shoulder. The late summer sun glinted off the metal, casting threatening reflections across the courtyard. All these fancy gates and guards, thinking they're better than the rest of us. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who'd spent more time in holding cells than classrooms. Families with children quickly moved away, parental instincts recognizing the predatory gleam in Thorne's eyes. His white tank top strained against his prison yard muscles, the fabric spotted with stains that might have been oil, might have been blood. Steel-toed boots, scuffed and scarred, carried him forward with deliberate menace. Guard James Harrison stood at his post, ceremonial rifle held precisely, eyes forward. 8 years of military service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, had taught him to recognize threats without betraying awareness. Through his peripheral vision, he noted everything about the approaching man, the way he moved, the weapon he carried, the intent in his stride. "Oi, look at this one," Thorne called out, tapping the bat against his palm. "Standing there like a proper statue, eh?" His London accent was thick with malice, each word carrying the weight of past violence. "Bet you think you're real special in that fancy uniform." The afternoon crowd had begun to thin rapidly, creating a visible circle of space around Thorne. A group of elderly tourists huddled near one of the palace gates, their concerned whispers carrying across the now quiet courtyard. A father hurried his young son away, trying to shield the boy's eyes from what was unfolding. Thorne's boots scuffed against the pavement as he planted himself 20 feet from Harrison's post. The bat swung lazily in his grip, each movement calculated to intimidate. "You know what I think about all this royal rubbish." He spat on the ground, the gesture deliberate and crude. "Think it's time someone showed you lot what real power looks like." Harrison remained motionless, but his mind was already calculating distances, angles, response times. His ceremonial rifle, though primarily for show, felt reassuring in his trained hands. Years of combat experience had taught him to read situations like this, to anticipate how they might unfold. The tension in the air was palpable now, thick enough to cut with a knife. Tourists reached for phones, not to take photos but to dial for help. A palace security camera swiveled silently, tracking Thorne's movements, but the man seemed beyond caring about consequences. "Time to have some fun," Thorne announced, rolling his shoulders like a boxer preparing to strike. "What's wrong, soldier boy?" His voice carried across the courtyard, each word dripping with contempt. "Too posh to talk to common folk like me?" The bat swung in lazy circles at his side, each rotation bringing it closer to a striking position. His knuckles, scarred from countless fights, whitened around the aluminum grip. A pair of elderly veterans had paused near the palace gates, their military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. The older one's hand moved unconsciously to the service pin on his lapel as he watched the scene unfold. His companion's weathered face showed the calm recognition of someone who'd seen similar situations escalate before. "Look at him standing there," Thorne continued, taking another step closer, all dressed up in his fancy costume, playing pretend soldier. His eyes, cold and calculating, searched for any sign of reaction from Harrison. The guard's continued composure seemed to fuel Thorne's growing anger. The late afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, highlighting the contrast between Harrison's immaculate uniform and Thorne's dishevelled appearance. A fresh prison tattoo peeked from beneath his tank top, the ink still slightly raised, suggesting he'd been released recently. The dates stenciled on his neck told their own story. 8 years served, probably for violent offences. "You know what I learned inside?" Thorne's voice dropped lower, meant for Harrison, but carrying to the nervous onlookers. "Learned that all this," he gestured at the palace with the bat, "all this fancy ceremony and tradition, it's just for show, just like you." He tapped the bat against his palm, the metallic sound sharp in the tense atmosphere. A young mother clutched her daughter's hand, trying to move away discreetly. The child's eyes were wide with fear, sensing the dangerous undercurrent in the air. "Mummy, why is that man so angry?" The question hung in the air, innocent and unanswered. The older veteran took a step forward, military training evident in his stance. "Son, you might want to reconsider your approach here." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded men in combat. "That uniform deserves more respect than you're showing." Thorne's head snapped around, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Respect?" He barked a harsh laugh. "I'll show you respect, old-timer." The bat swung up to rest on his shoulder, the movement deliberately threatening. 8 years I spent locked up, while people like him, he jerked his head toward Harrison, played dress-up for tourists. Think I give a toss about respect? Harrison remained motionless, but his training had him acutely aware of every detail. The way Thorne's weight shifted slightly to his front foot, suggesting he was used to striking first. The calculated distance he maintained, just far enough to swing the bat with full force, the slight tremor in his free hand that hinted at either drug use or adrenaline build-up. "Here's what I think about your precious uniform," Thorne spat again, this time closer to Harrison's boots. The glob of saliva landed on the immaculate courtyard stones, a deliberate desecration of the sacred ground. "It's just fancy dress for men too weak to handle real violence. Bet you've never even been in a real fight, have you, soldier boy?" The irony of his words might have been amusing if the situation weren't so volatile. Harrison's mind flashed briefly to firefights in Afghan mountains, to close-quarter combat in mud-walled compounds, to brothers lost in battles this street thug couldn't imagine. But his face remained impassive, his bearing perfect. "Look at him," Thorne turned to address the reluctant audience, playing to the crowd like a performer. "Standing there all proper and disciplined. Reckon that discipline'll hold when I test it." The bat tapped against the ground, counting out an ominous rhythm. "Because that's what I do, mate. I test things, break them. Been doing it all my life." The younger veteran had pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. Palace security would already be responding, but the situation was escalating too quickly for a measured response. In his experienced eye, he could see this confrontation racing toward a violent conclusion. Thorne began to circle closer, each step calculated, predatory. The bat never stopped moving, a constant reminder of the threat he posed. Time to show everyone here what happens to men who hide behind fancy uniforms and tradition. His voice had taken on an edge of anticipation, like a hunter closing in on prey. "Time to see what you're really made of, soldier boy." The aluminum bat whistled through the air as Thorne took a practice swing, the sound cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. "See, in prison, we had a saying," he drawled, each word measured and threatening. "The fancier the uniform, the weaker the man wearing it." Harrison's peripheral vision caught every detail of Thorne's movement patterns. the way he favoured his right side, the slight limp suggesting an old injury, the practiced grip on the bat that spoke of experience with weapons. Through years of combat training, he'd learned to read opponents without appearing to watch them. "You're making a serious mistake here, son," the older veteran called out, his voice carrying the weight of command. "That man you're threatening, he's not just some ceremonial guard. These men are active duty soldiers." "Active duty what?" Thorne spun toward the veteran, bat cutting an arc through the air. "Active duty tourist attraction?" His laugh was sharp and ugly. "Look at him, standing there like a bloody statue while I—" He took another step closer to Harrison. "While I do this." The bat swung within inches of Harrison's face, a deliberate provocation that stirred gasps from the watching crowd, but the guard didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't give any indication that he'd noticed the deadly weapon that had nearly grazed his nose. "Nothing? Not even a twitch?" Thorne's voice took on a darker edge. "Let's see how still you can stand when I start getting creative." He began moving the bat in more complex patterns, each swing coming closer to Harrison's immaculate uniform. The afternoon sun caught the aluminum, creating flashes of light that made several onlookers wince. A palace security officer had appeared at the edge of the crowd, radio raised to his mouth as he assessed the situation. But Thorne was too focused on his target to notice, his movements becoming more aggressive with each passing moment. "In the yard," he continued, circling ever closer, "we had blokes like you. Thought they were hard because they had authority, wore a uniform." The bat tapped against Harrison's ceremonial rifle, the metallic clang echoing across the courtyard. "Know what happened to them? They learned. Oh, they learned quick." The younger veteran had begun quietly moving families back, his combat experience recognizing the signs of imminent violence. "Clear the area," he whispered to a mother with two small children. "This isn't going to end well." Thorne's next swing stopped just short of Harrison's bearskin cap, disturbing the fur with its passage. "Look at this fancy hat. Bet it cost more than I made in a year inside." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Wonder how it'd look with some dents in it." The bat's movement patterns had changed now, becoming less theatrical and more focused. Anyone with combat experience could see Thorne was done playing. He was setting up for a real attack. His feet had shifted into a fighter's stance, his breathing had steadied, and his eyes had taken on the cold focus of someone about to commit violence. "Last chance, soldier boy," Thorne announced, rolling his shoulders like a boxer preparing to strike. "Show me you're actually human. Move, speak, do something." The bat tapped against the ground between them, counting down like a metronome. "Because if you don't—" Harrison remained motionless, but his muscles had tensed imperceptibly beneath his uniform. Years of close-quarter combat training had taught him to recognize the millisecond before an attack, that crucial moment when intent crystallized into action. "Your choice, then." Thorne's voice had dropped to a growl. "Time to learn what happens when you—" He cut himself off mid-sentence, a classic prisoner's trick meant to catch opponents off guard. The bat suddenly whipped up from its lowered position, aimed directly at Harrison's head. The crowd's collective gasp was drowned out by the whistle of aluminum through air. Time seemed to slow as the weapon traced its deadly arc toward the guard's skull. Several people turned away, unable to watch what they thought would be a tragic impact. But they had severely underestimated what it meant to wear the uniform of the Queen's Guard. Harrison hadn't spent years in combat zones, hadn't earned his stripes in some of the world's most dangerous places, to fall to a common thug with a baseball bat. The next few seconds would demonstrate the difference between theatrical aggression and trained combat efficiency, between someone who'd learned violence in prison yards and someone who'd mastered it in war zones, between an attacker who thought a uniform meant weakness and a soldier who'd earned every thread of it in blood and sacrifice. As the bat completed its arc toward his head, Harrison's combat-trained mind processed the scenario with military precision. Years of close-quarter combat training had taught him to read the subtle tells. Thorne's weight distribution, the tension in his shoulders, the slight telegraph in his grip. Before the aluminum weapon had covered half the distance, Harrison had already mapped out his response with tactical clarity. The bat cut through the air at killing velocity, its whistling sound drawing gasps from the crowd. But where Thorne expected to meet Skull, he found only empty space. Harrison's movement was precise, economical. No wasted motion, no theatrical dodge. He simply wasn't where the bat expected him to be. In the microseconds that followed, Harrison's ceremonial rifle transformed from symbolic accessory to combat instrument. The movement was fluid, almost beautiful in its efficiency. As he stepped inside Thorne's swing, a counterintuitive move that only highly trained fighters would attempt, the rifle butt traced a perfect arc of its own. Years of military drilling, combined with battlefield experience, guided the hardwood stock directly into Thorne's solar plexus, finding the exact point where ribs meet abdomen. The impact was devastating in its precision. Not wild, not angry, just perfectly calculated force, delivered exactly where it would have maximum effect with minimum injury. The crack of wood against flesh echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot, followed by the distinctive whoosh of air forcibly evacuating lungs. But Harrison was already executing the next phase of his response. His left hand, still encased in its ceremonial white glove, shot out with snake-like speed. His fingers found Thorne's weapon wrist with surgical accuracy, each digit positioned to compress specific pressure points. This wasn't the crude grip of a street fighter. This was the refined technique of someone trained in military hand-to-hand combat. "What the—" Thorne's exclamation came out as a strangled gasp, surprise morphing into panic as he felt the professional fighting grip lock around his arm. His attempt to pull away only made Harrison's hold more secure. Each finger was perfectly placed to cut off blood flow to specific muscles, a technique taught to special forces for weapon disarmament. Harrison's voice cut through the chaos with Arctic authority. "Drop it!" The command carried the weight of someone who'd issued similar orders in combat zones where hesitation meant death. His grip adjusted fractionally, not squeezing harder, but rather finding more precise pressure points that sent shooting pain through Thorne's weapon hand. 8 years of prison fights had taught Thorne to never back down, but they hadn't prepared him for this level of combat expertise. His free hand launched a desperate punch toward Harrison's face, throwing his full body weight behind it. The guard's response made the attack look almost comical. A minimal head shift, just enough to let the fist pass harmlessly through where his jaw had been milliseconds before. Not ducking, not flinching, just efficient movement that made Thorne's street fighting look amateurish by comparison. "Last warning," Harrison's tone remained professional, devoid of emotion. His grip had begun to take full effect, targeting nerve clusters that would make Thorne's fingers gradually lose their strength. The bat grew heavier in his weakening grasp, as blood flow was systematically restricted. Desperation written across his face, Thorne launched into a prison yard headbutt, the kind of brutal attack that had won him countless fights behind bars. He threw his entire body into it, neck muscles straining, forehead aimed like a battering ram. But his street-learned technique telegraphed the move to Harrison's trained eye long before impact. The guard's response was a masterclass in military movement. Rather than meeting force with force, Harrison shifted his weight with balletic precision. A subtle hip rotation, a slight adjustment of his center of gravity, and he was no longer occupying the space Thorne's head was hurtling through. The motion was so economical that onlookers would later debate whether he'd moved at all. Thorne's forward momentum, finding no target, carried him past his point of balance, exactly as Harrison had calculated. In that split second of vulnerability, the guard executed a combination of moves that demonstrated the gulf between prison yard brawling and professional military combat training. Harrison's boot, still parade ground polished, swept in a precise arc that found the exact point behind Thorne's knee, where balance could be most effectively compromised. Simultaneously, his grip on Thorne's wrist transitioned from a blood flow control hold to a joint manipulation lock. The timing was perfect. As Thorne's legs began to buckle, Harrison applied rotational force to the wrist, using his opponent's own momentum to multiply the effect. The combination of forces, downward, rotational and forward, created a perfect storm of physical principles. Thorne's body, suddenly subject to multiple vectors of force, had no choice but to follow the path of least resistance. The bat, its grip now held by nerveless fingers, clattered against the courtyard stones with a metallic finality. But Harrison wasn't merely subduing an attacker. He was demonstrating the difference between violence and control. As Thorne's back met the ground, the guard's ceremonial rifle was already in position, its wooden stock finding the precise point on the sternum where pressure could control without causing injury. The movement was so fluid, so technically perfect, that it appeared choreographed, as if Thorne were a willing participant in this demonstration of military efficiency. "Stay down," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the same parade ground precision as his movements. His posture remained ceremonially correct, even in combat, drills square perfect, despite the violence of the last few seconds. "The Metropolitan Police are already on their way." Something in that voice, perhaps the complete lack of exertion, the professional calm, seemed to shatter what remained of Thorne's prison yard confidence. But like a cornered animal, he resorted to one last desperate gambit. His hand shot toward his boot with the speed of someone used to concealed weapons, fingers grasping for the hidden blade that glinted dully in the afternoon sun. Harrison's response demonstrated why soldiers train endlessly for weapon threats. The rifle butt shifted with surgical precision, finding the intercostal nerve cluster just below Thorne's ribs. The pressure was mathematically perfect, enough to send waves of paralyzing pain through the chest cavity, but carefully calibrated to avoid any actual damage. This was the technique of someone who had disarmed knife-wielding insurgents, who understood exactly how much force to apply for maximum effect with minimum harm. "That knife," Harrison's voice carried the same controlled precision as his combat moves, filling the now silent courtyard with quiet authority, "will only make your situation worse." For the first time, his eyes met Thorne's directly. In that gaze was something that had been forged in firefights and close-quarter battles, the steady look of a warrior who had faced down much deadlier weapons than a boot knife. The two veterans had instinctively moved to support positions, their own military training evident in their positioning, but they quickly realized their assistance wasn't necessary. Harrison had the situation under complete control, his every movement displaying the kind of tactical mastery that only comes from years of real combat experience. "You think," Thorne gasped, still struggling to catch his breath from the initial strike, "you think this proves anything? You're still just playing soldier, just—" "Private James Harrison, Royal Marines," the guard cut him off, his voice carrying the steel of actual battlefield command. "2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. This uniform isn't a costume, sir. It's earned through blood and sacrifice, concepts you clearly don't understand." Thorne's face contorted with rage, but the knife in his boot remained untouched. Something in Harrison's bearing, the coiled combat readiness beneath the ceremonial stance, warned him that any further escalation would end very badly. The sound of police sirens grew closer, but Harrison's position didn't shift an inch. His rifle maintained perfect pressure, his posture remained parade ground precise, and his eyes never left Thorne's face. This was a man who had held position under enemy fire in war zones. Maintaining control of an arrested thug was well within his capabilities. 8 years inside, Thorne spat. though the bravado had drained from his voice. "And I've never seen anyone move like that." "That's because you've never faced a real soldier before," Harrison replied, his tone professional rather than boastful. "Only men playing at violence, there's a difference." The police arrived to find a scene that would have looked almost ceremonial if not for Thorne's prone position. Harrison had controlled the situation with such military precision that there wasn't even a scuff on his immaculate uniform. As officers moved in to take custody of Thorne, Harrison smoothly stepped back, his ceremonial rifle returning to its proper position. His movements were fluid, precise. The transition from combat back to ceremony seamless and professional. Thorne, being cuffed and led away, looked back one final time. The guard had resumed his post as if nothing had happened, his bearing perfect, his duty uninterrupted. "Assault with a deadly weapon, threatening behaviour on palace grounds," the lead officer read out as his colleagues secured Thorne. "You've managed to earn yourself quite a sentence here." The handcuffs clicked shut, with a finality that even Thorne couldn't ignore. But true to his nature, the thug remained defiant even in defeat. "He's the one who assaulted me," Thorne protested, struggling against the restraints. "Standing there in his fancy dress, thinking he's better than—" "That's enough," the officer cut him off sharply. "We have dozens of witnesses and clear security footage. Your lucky guard Harrison showed such restraint." His eyes flickered to the baseball bat being tagged as evidence. "Many would have responded with far more force." The older veteran stepped forward, his military bearing evident as he addressed the officers. "I witnessed the entire incident. The guard's response was exemplary. Minimum force, maximum efficiency. Textbook military control of a hostile situation." Harrison remained at his post, his posture revealing nothing of the intense combat encounter that had just transpired. The afternoon sun caught his brass buttons, which somehow remained perfectly polished despite the altercation. His ceremonial rifle had returned to its precise position, showing no signs of its recent use as a defensive weapon. "You don't understand," Thorne continued, ranting as officers began leading him away. "These guards, they're just for show. I proved—" "The only thing you proved," the younger veteran interrupted, "is the difference between prison yard violence and military discipline. I'd say Guard Harrison demonstrated quite effectively what these men are capable of." As Thorne was guided toward the waiting police vehicle, his previous bravado had dissolved into impotent rage. The bat that had seemed so threatening minutes ago was now being carefully bagged by evidence technicians, its aluminum surface marked with his fingerprints, silent testimony to his failed attack. Two palace security officers conferred briefly with Harrison, their conversation professional and concise. The guards' responses were minimal, perfect protocol maintained even in the aftermath of combat. His duty hadn't ended with the confrontation. It continued, unbroken and dignified. The gathered crowd began to disperse, but their departing glances carried new understanding. They'd witnessed something rare, the seamless transition between ceremonial guard and trained warrior, and back again. The uniform that Thorne had mocked as a costume had proven to be anything but. "All right, clear the area, please," an officer announced, beginning to establish a proper perimeter. "The palace grounds need to resume normal operations." Harrison stood unchanged at his post, as steady and dignified as the palace walls behind him. If not for the police activity and the evidence markers on the ground, one might never have known that minutes ago he'd neutralized an armed attacker with clinical military precision. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Thorne's angry protests faded as the police vehicle pulled away, carrying with it his delusions about ceremonial guards being easy targets. He'd learned, though not in the way he'd intended, that the Queen's Guard were far more than their ceremonial duties suggested. Without ceremony or fanfare, regular tourist activities began to resume. Harrison remained at his post, just as he had before Thorne's appearance, just as he would until his duty shift ended. The only difference was the newfound respect in the eyes of those who now understood that beneath every ceremonial uniform stood a warrior whose training and dedication were anything but ceremonial. The two veterans, before departing, faced Harrison and offered crisp salutes, soldier to soldier, warrior to warrior. The guard's response, though subtle, carried the same mutual respect. No words were needed. They understood what had transpired here today. If you've enjoyed this powerful story about honor, duty, and the true meaning of strength, make sure to hit that like button right now. Your support helps us continue bringing you these important reminders of why we must respect and protect our traditions. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to never miss another story about the Royal Guards and the values they protect. Hit that bell icon to get notified as soon as we upload our next video. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Check out our previous videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one offers a unique perspective on the dedication and professionalism of these remarkable soldiers who stand guard over our most cherished institutions. But before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you witnessed this attack on a royal guard? Would you have stepped in, called for help, or trusted in the guard's training to handle the situation? More importantly, how should society deal with those who show such blatant disrespect for our institutions and traditions? Is there a way to prevent such incidents? Or are they an unfortunate price of maintaining open access to our historical sites? Share your thoughts below. We read every comment and love engaging with our community. Remember to share this video with someone who needs to understand the true meaning of strength and discipline. Together we can spread awareness about the importance of respecting our guardians of tradition. See you in the next one.